Hello, my name is David Bryan, and this is Curiosity Invited, a podcast inspired by endless curiosity. Tune in for an open-minded conversation about interesting and important things. Hello, and welcome to Curiosity Invited. My name is David Bryan, and this week I had the great pleasure of speaking with Danny Goldberg, which you'll see in a moment. It may not be a name you know well, but Danny is a music journalist, a writer, is steeped in the music business, both primarily as a manager of performing artists, musicians, names you would absolutely recognize: the Allman Brothers, Stevie Nicks, Bonnie Raitt, Nirvana, etc., and much more recently, currently, Steve Earle, Tom Morello, Alison Moorer, Ben Lee. I mean, it's, it goes on and on. And also in the course of his career, he's worked in the record business, the musical labels, publishing, etc. And although his titles don't sound like the rest of our titles, chair and CEO of Mercury Records, chair and CEO of Warner Brothers Records, president of Atlantic Records, founder of Artemis Records. So it goes on and on. And he's also an author. He's written several books. I want to make sure I get those right. Bumping Into Geniuses by Gotham Books, published by Gotham Books. In 2004, he wrote How the Left Lost Teen Spirit, which is published by Akashic Books, and co-edited an anthology. And most recently, in 2021, he published which is to say Akashic Books, published Bloody Crossroads 2020, Art, Entertainment, and Resistance to Trump. And again, I think it was published this year, 2021. He's also done a lot of work in politics, both ACLU Board, the Nation Institute, Americans for Peace Now, and he's on the board of Brave New Films, which is actually, that's how I know Danny. I too am on that board, Truth in Advertising, and really looking forward to this conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. So I already recorded essentially my bio, your bio, my intro to you, and which I took from one of the many bios that are out there for you. Wow, you've had a bunch of stuff going on.
Well, I've been in the music business since the late '60s, and kind of a quasi music business activist since 1980. So it's just the quantity of time, and then you compress it into a paragraph, 50 plus years. It looks like a lot. In real time, it seems to go very slowly and not much going on. But when you compress it into a couple of paragraphs, it's, whoa, what a life. Well,
Yes, exactly. I get it. But at the same time, that's probably true for a lot of people. And yet theirs doesn't say chairman and CEO of Atlantic Records or Warner Brothers Records. So, well, let me, if you don't mind, I would love to start by asking you something. So what's a music guy doing as an activist, messing around in politics? Or has there always been a marriage that we just don't think about?
Well, there's been certain musical artists over the years, and therefore some of the people who work with them have also had an interest in politics. I mean, going back to Woody Guthrie or Harry Belafonte. Right. Harry Belafonte was a significant advisor to Dr. King. I graduated from high school in 1967 at the peak of the Vietnam War, and there were musical artists like Phil Oakes and some of the songs of the Jefferson Airplane and Country Joe, and songs like The Universal Soldier, and some of Dylan's early songs that were clearly very, very political. So just in my head, kind of the rock and roll that I fell in love with as a teenager, and kind of new age spirituality, and get associated for me with psychedelics as a doorway to it,
Yeah.
and progressive politics in those years, the anti-war movement in particular, were all kind of smushed together in one place. Then when I got into the music business, I was just trying to make a living. And it was in 79, after about 10 years of starting as a journalist and then a publicist, I had a PR client named John Hall. He'd been the lead guitarist and principal songwriter of a band called
Sure.
Orleans.
Yeah, I
He
remember
had a
them
couple of big hits, Still the
very
One,
well.
Dance with Me. And
Exactly.
he also, he later became a congressperson and served in the House of Representatives for 2 terms from upstate New York, because he was very, very interested, particularly in environmental issues, particularly in the environmental and health hazards of nuclear power. So he asked me to help him put on a press conference. I think this was 78, with James Taylor and Bonnie Raitt. It was Artists Against Nuclear Energy. This around the time of the Karen Silkwood
Yeah.
case, and just before 3 Mile Island accident. And then after the 3 Mile Island accident, they put together these concerts at Madison Square Garden, and I talked Jackson Browne into the idea that there should be a movie of this. And my friend Julian Schlossberg and I produced and directed a movie called No Nukes.
No nukes, right?
That was a documentary that included some great Springsteen footage, which the outtakes of which have just been made public, and Jackson Browne and Crosby, Stills and Nash, Gil Scott-Heron, and others. And then I remember we did a screening of it in Los Angeles, and in the row in back of me was Jerry Brown, and I just said, "Holy mackerel! This thing that I'm part of is interesting enough that Jerry Brown, who I idolized as a would come." And it showed me that there was a lane between the entertainment business and politics. If you wanted to walk down the lane, they wanted fundraisers, they wanted celebrities. There was a need to get ideas out. And so then from then on, I was like the rock activist, certainly not the only one in the business that had those feelings, but a group of, I don't know, a bunch of us that just figured, hey, we could have our cake and eat it too, in a way. And as long as we work with artists who were cool with it, and a lot of artists were. So that was sort of the turning point. And then over the years, then I got recruited to be the chair of the ACLU of Southern California, which was a transformative experience. I mean,
Sure.
the time I was doing that included the time of the Rodney King beating and getting rid of Daryl Gates, the racist police chief of LA.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
somewhere over the course of, by the end of the 80s, I was a full blown, this is part of my identity inside my own head, and to a certain extent publicly.
And have you ever worked with clients? So in addition to managing a label, right, you've also managed artists' career. Have you ever worked with artists whose political views were sort of antithetical? Because
yes,
yeah. Tell me.
Absolutely. I've never felt that there was some sort of a litmus test for me to work with an artist, except that they thought I could. And most of my career has been representing artists. I ran labels for, in the 50 years of being around the music business, there's only about a dozen of those years that I was a record company person. A greater amount of time I've been a personal manager, including for the last 15 years. And yeah, sure. In my old company, Gold Mountain, which was the company where we ended up managing Nirvana, I remember when the first Gulf War was happening, Lenny Kravitz was a client, and he wanted to put together a video remake. He did a remake of Give Peace a Chance, with the idea of let's not get into the First Iraq War. And at the exact same time, I was managing the great record producer and songwriter David Foster.
Oh, sure.
Who wrote a song with his wife called Voices That Care, which is to support the troops, or as a friend of mine said at the time, give war a chance. And both of them were organized out of my office. And I was very proud of that, because I'm never been shy about what my own political beliefs are, but I certainly respect the idea that good people, and certainly talented people, might have the opposite point of view. When I had Artemis Records, we put out Jimmy Vaughan's records, one of which won a Grammy. I was very proud to do that. And he was a supporter of George W. Bush, and I was not. So, and then a lot of artists I've worked with don't particularly have any politics. I've worked with a number of artists that aren't Americans, and therefore the American politics is not as interested to them. Like right now, several. So yeah, I've never made it sort of a litmus test in my
Have
own
they?
head.
Have
And
any of your clients, like when they found out, wait, what were you doing at that Give Peace a Chance
no,
event?
I think people kind of know who I am. There might be people that chose not to work with me because of that. I would never know that.
Right.
Um, but I haven't found it been a source of drama in my day job. That it's pretty much trying to represent someone in their career is one thing, political stuff is another. Every once in a while they overlap. For the last 15 years, I've managed a singer-songwriter named Steve Earle, who's certainly also been politically outspoken periodically, and we share a lot of the same
Hmm.
beliefs. But it's sometimes it overlaps, sometimes it doesn't. Um, I've never made a secret of my values, nor do I ever impose them on the people I work with.
Right. Sure. So I'm going to ask an incredibly naive question that has nothing to do with politics, but really is about the music business. So a personal manager is not, or somebody who manages an artist's career is not an agent, right? It is something else. What is that else?
Well, it includes some of the roles that movie agents play for their or actors agents play, because the word agent in the music business solely refers to what we call booking agents, booking
Right.
live shows. So for example, music agents have nothing to do with records. They don't make record deals, they don't negotiate them, they're not involved with the marketing of records, they're not involved with songwriting deals, music publishing, etc. They're booking agents. So to begin, so they're very, very important in artists' careers. Everybody that I manage also has a booking agent, but booking agents, sometimes they get to know the artist, sometimes they don't even hardly get to know them. It's a particular service that's quite valuable, but that is just involved with one aspect of an artist's career. A manager is an advisor to and kind of the CEO of the set of businesses around an artist, which includes records, songwriting. A lot of the people I've worked with are multimedia artists and write books or do acting, licensing for use of music in movies or commercials, and touring. And then the other thing about music agents is typically they only work in one country. So, sometimes a US booking agent will also book Canada, but that's it. So with a lot of the artists I represent, we'll have multiple agents. We'll have a European agent, we'll have a North American agent, sometimes Australian agent. So, the manager in the music business is sort of the center of the wheel with the different spokes coming out of it, and typically is the closest person to the artist, who they call when there's a problem, who's the go-between with a lot of these other people. It varies from artist to artist and manager to manager. Sometimes it includes sort of big picture strategic advice. Sometimes it's just about providing day-to-day services.
Mhm.
But in general, the key difference is that it's holistic and involves all aspects of a career, whereas the booking agents are booking shows for tours.
Yeah, thank you. And I probably do have one other music question that, maybe
Yeah.
tedious to you, but so obviously lots has changed in the music business since the advent of streaming, et cetera, et cetera. And uh, well, some combination of better, worse, very different, not so different.
Um,
What's this? What's
well,
this most significant change other than nobody's holding a CD anymore?
um, well, it's a dramatic change in the record business. Again, I always say the music business, it's better to use it plural, music businesses plural, because touring, concerts, very important part of it, most musical careers, and that has not changed that much. I mean, there are incremental changes, but the basic business model is very much the same. Whereas the recorded music business is dramatically different. And old timers like me are still getting used to it.
Hmm.
But I mean, from a consumer's point of view, as a fan, I love the streaming services that I can just anywhere I want, I can listen to anything I want. I mean, I totally understand why it's so popular, because
Right.
a consumer that enjoys that service. And so I think it's an irreversible trend because it's just a better delivery system for fans.
Right.
In terms of the way that artists get paid, it's it's controversial and confusing. And I certainly don't understand all the aspects of it. Generally speaking, it substitutes kind of a one-time purchase of, what used to be an album or a compact disc, or in between the glorious cassette era, um, with thousands, if not millions, of micro payments over, as far as the eye can see. So in terms of the short-term situation for a lot of artists, it's much worse because they're getting less, maybe on a annual basis in terms of royalties than they would have gotten selling CDs. In terms of the asset value of the recordings, it's actually greater because Wall Street now looks at streaming services and they see they're paying multiples of 15, 20 times of earnings to own these things, because they see micropayments stretching off into as close to infinity as
Sure.
the mind
Right.
can
Right.
see. And that's why you see Bruce Springsteen and Bob Dylan and Neil Young and a lot of artists with big catalogs selling now, because it's a seller's market. The value of those catalogs has probably doubled. A couple of my clients, I've negotiated transactions, not for the same amount of money that Springsteen or Dylan get, but significant sums to them. So if you have a catalog, it's an improvement in terms of the value of the catalog. If you're a new artist, you're going to look to much less income from your recordings than you would have gotten 20 or 30 years ago.
Much less income, but potentially a broader audience. So when you tour, more people may have seen your
It's
YouTube.
so hard. It's so hard to know. The marketing side of it is very confusing also, because a lot of people stream songs based on so-called playlists, and how those playlists are formed and how many people those are sent to is shrouded in a certain amount of opacity or secrecy. Back in the day, the old days, you had these big radio stations that reached most of your audience, and you tried any way you could to get them to play the record, sometimes corrupt, sometimes authentic. I always used to say, as someone who represented artists, that I liked the payola system because it meant if I believed in someone enough, I could give them a shot.
You could do that.
I could see why people felt it was not really like the necessarily the best system for the society in general. But, every era has its strengths and weaknesses from the point of view of artists. There's always been a lot of artists that are very unhappy because for one reason or another, they're not making a living, or making the living they feel they should make from the music business. And in every era, the big stars do really, really well. And then most aspiring artists need a day job. And then there's this category in the middle. And I liked it when we could sell compact discs. First of all, I understood the economics. You knew exactly what the money was coming in. You could audit it. You could renegotiate. But that's gone. It's not coming back. So what I do like is the ubiquity of the availability of music. It's challenging for artists to figure out how to market themselves. I'm not sure it was ever so easy. But it's definitely that's a gigantic paradigm shift, the recorded music side of it.
Got it. But it hasn't chased you away.
The touring side of it is not that different than it always was, except ticket prices and festivals and older artists like to sit down. I mean, older audiences like to sit down, and different things. But
all that rushing the stage is so tiring.
I just find standing on my feet is tiring. But, at different ages, different things.
Well, so let's pivot a little bit and talk about some of that overlap, because your recent book, right, Bloody Crossroads 2020, artists, entertainment and resistance to Trump. And okay, so why now? Why did you feel like you needed to write that?
Sure. I've been interested in this overlap for quite a long time, particularly since the late 80s, early 90s, when I was ACLU chair in Los Angeles and got to know a lot of a lot of the people that in so-called Hollywood that were activists, like our mutual friend Robert Greenwald, and people like Barbara Streisand, Jane Fonda, and Warren Beatty of that era. Norman Lear seems to be a thought leader in every era,
Always. It's
and
unbelievable.
and so forth. And I always felt that as sort of a Democrat and as a progressive, I always had a nagging feeling that there wasn't quite the amount of coordination or mutual respect that was optimum. But and I always was fascinated by it. Also, just not only activism but political art. I mean, movies like the China Syndrome, when Jane Fonda made that on the nuclear power issue, reached more people than any op-ed
Yes.
was going to. And going back to Uncle Tom's Cabin, which Lincoln attributed with changing the paradigm of white view of slavery and things like that. So with Trump, though, I felt everything changed dramatically, not only in many other respects that are widely chronicled, but he was from reality television, or so-called reality television. I mean, one thing people in show business know, reality television doesn't have much to do with reality,
Right.
but it's those shows are edited and scripted. But it was his 14 years on primetime NBC that branded him as this genius businessman, that gave him the ability to convince enough people that he'd be a good national leader to pull it off. And as a result of his origins there, the explosion of involvement from a much wider group of entertainers than had ever taken place before occurred even before he was inaugurated, after the election.
Why do you think that? Why do you think that is? Is it because he was so?
I think it's a confluence of several different reasons that created kind of this perfect storm. One is definitely because he was a product of show business, and so other people who'd seen him at parties or the Golden Globes or whatever just said, "Oh my God, if somebody like that could get that kind of power, we have to speak up. We have to get involved." Secondly, the way he was elected, there were two. Certainly there was an aura of racism in the way he was elected, both in terms of the way he spoke about Mexican Americans and others from Latin America coming in, about Muslims, and his history with African Americans. The calling the big leader of the so-called, he was the most prominent figure in the so-called birther movement, questioning Barack Obama's birth, and earlier, during the so-called Central Park Five trial, he called for the execution of these guys who were later exonerated, with DNA evidence, and he still didn't recant his call for their execution. So, and race has been a very hot button issue in the creative community. Not that movies and records and theater and everybody has always handled race correctly, and but it's been a moral imperative for a lot of creative people, certainly since the civil rights movement, since Belafonte organized people like Marlon Brando and everything. I think you add to that that Trump got elected, defeating the first woman to run on a major ticket, and in a campaign where he gleefully boasted about grabbing women by the pussy, on a Access Hollywood tape, and the Me Too movement, I think, was so intertwined with the frustration and rage of her defeat in those circumstances, especially when she got more popular votes. So I think that those issues combined with the fact that he came from show business, and then the third factor was the fragmentation of the political media because of the social media, the digital world, where the arenas that's influenced political opinion so much, like the three TV networks and the New York Times and Washington Post, they still exist, but they're much less powerful than they were because of all the other fragmentation and the emergence of Twitter and Trump's particular use of Twitter. And Taylor Swift has a lot more Twitter followers than anyone in the House of Representatives. And suddenly the ability to reach a fan base also became another part of currency during this kind of a digital populist era of political conversation. So I think those different phenomena kind of combined with I think race and gender and Trump's background at the center of it. And but for whatever reason, almost overnight, there was the Women's March, where a lot of the people who spoke at it were from the entertainment business, people like Madonna and different actresses and so on. And the when Jon Stewart started hosting the Daily Show in 1999, he was the only person on every night combining comedy with politics. After Trump, it was every show every night. In the previous decades, the pop stars that had the biggest mass audience, people like Whitney Houston, Mariah Carey, and even Madonna, were either not political at all or very limited in what they would say. After Trump, you had the biggest pop stars, Demi Lovato, Cardi B, Taylor Swift, Lady Gaga, Billie Eilish, like actively involved.
And do you think, is there reason to believe that it was influential? Right. I mean, it certainly created, buzz. Right?
Well, I mean, if there was influence, there's no way exactly of measuring, because when they go to vote, they're the product of hundreds of different pieces of input from their family, from political advertising, from churches and synagogues, from reading, from their friends, and entertainment is part of what's in their brain. But my theory is that where it makes a difference is not in changing anyone's mind about whether or not they like Trump, but I do think it can change someone's mind about whether or not it's worth voting at all.
Voting or not.
Yeah. Right. And I think in terms of creating a sense of urgency for reluctant voters, or for people that aren't so sure if there's enough of a difference between the parties that it's worth voting for one of the two parties, or maybe you vote for a Green Party or something like that. In terms of creating a sense of urgency and intensity to depend whether you vote or not, or whether you vote Democrat or a third party or not, that cohort of people, I think, are particularly younger people, because the entertainment culture tends to skew younger, and the younger people tend to skew more to the left. Mm-hmm. So raising the turnout, I think in terms of that, it could make a difference. I certainly don't think it changes someone's mind about whether or not they like Donald Trump, or whether or not they consider themselves a liberal or conservative. But turnout is a big deal. If you're a Democrat, if everybody votes, we win. If it's a depressed voters, we usually lose, because they're well organized, in getting their base out. So I think turnout's extremely important. It's not the only important thing. I respect the people that are trying to figure out how to communicate with the so-called people in the middle, and God bless them. But I think a big part of the reason Biden won was a higher turnout among younger people and a lower percentage of people voting third party.
Third party, right. I think that was... Yeah, I mean, I know for me, well, having been living in California, right, I knew which way the state was going to go.
Yeah, right.
And so did I need to vote Democratic, or could I vote for a Green Party to make a statement about Democrats? It didn't really matter, right? So.
Oh, I voted. Listen, yeah. I voted in New York most of my life, and I voted for Ralph Nader in 1996 and in 2000, because I was sure that the Democrat was going to win New York State.
Right, exactly.
And so I felt it was okay to make a protest vote and to just show people there are some of us that are not happy in the case of 96 about the welfare bill, whatever.
Yeah.
If I lived in a swing state, I really would not have done that, because I never had any doubt in my mind that Al Gore would have been a better president than George H.W. Bush. But but there were people in swing states who voted third party.
Yes, those are the ones.
And if you look at statistics, 5.7% of all the voters in 2016 voted either for the Greens or the Libertarians, and that made the difference in 5 or 6 states. If Hillary in 2020, that percentage was down to 1.7%. That 4-point difference made the difference in the swing states. Yeah, assuming that most of those votes went for Biden instead of Trump, which I think is a reasonable assumption, not that anyone can prove it. And then in terms of the magnitude of the turnout versus a low turnout, it's a higher turnout doesn't always benefit the Democrats, but a higher turnout of our voters always benefits the Democrats. Yes. And that's where I think the culture can create that sense of what's cool, what's not cool, what's urgent, what's at stake. And so I think it's part of that atmosphere. That's my theory about it.
It's so interesting to me that it's the the Republicans the more conservative voters, the Republicans, they're so good at staying, quote, on message. And although many people in the arts, excuse me, are creative, progressive, lean in that direction, you know, for every Ed Asner, there's a Ronald Reagan. Like maybe for every Tom Morello, there's a Ted Nugent. And yet the
No,
right
no, no.
the right
That's
has never been the right has never been good at really organizing they get Kid Rock and Ted Nugent on stage, but
first of all, I would say again, I don't think you could prove this mathematically, or I haven't tried to study the mathematical aspect of it, but in general, a much higher percentage of entertainers skew to the left and to the right.
well,
You're right.
that's
There
good
are
to
always
hear. That's good to
exceptions,
hear.
but it's not that for every Ed Asner there's a Ronald Reagan. For every 5 Ed Asners, there's a Ronald Reagan. For every 5 Tom Morellos, there's a Ted
Yes.
Nugent. There's no comparison. But there are some people like that. And look, they've plucked 2 people from Hollywood and put them in the White House.
Yes.
Reagan and Trump do not get into politics if they weren't pre-branded in show business. Same with George Murphy, former senator from
Arnold Schwarzenegger,
California. So I think the Republicans recognize the power of a populist
yes.
Communication and energy.
Yes.
But I think the spirit of most artists, not just in this era, but in every era, and not just in this country, but in every country, skews to the left. And so that's an advantage we have. Hopefully it sometimes countermands their advantage of money, but in terms of on message, look, their basic philosophy, particularly in this era,
yes,
in the Trump era, is authoritarianism. So of course, being on message, you salute the Fuhrer, our philosophy is democracy, which involves,
which is very messy and fighting
disagreement. Yeah. So that's the price we pay for our beliefs. I think it's worth it, but it does take discipline and focus to counteract, propaganda. And, repetition is a big part of it. And I think having hundreds of different people tweeting, Trump was an ideal foil, because he made the talking points easy for people who were against him. It's more complicated without him in the White House. But, I just think that unless you get a very high turnout among younger people and among people of color, we don't have a prayer, especially in a system that's already distorted to favor minority white rule.
Yes, right. And so do you see this happening? I don't the coming together. Do you see that happening again, or because Trump's not in it?
It's a lot's going to depend on. It's a synergistic thing between the political leadership of the country and the creative community. I think the individual artists who were involved in the 2020 election, especially in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, in the wake of COVID, and in the context of Trump, once somebody becomes political, they usually stay that way. They realize, oh my God, my career didn't end. There's always that fear of, am I going to lose a lot of my fans? I mean, Taylor Swift talks about this in this documentary she made called Miss Americana. Guess what? She's as big as ever. She's one of the most successful artists ever. And plus, I think it becomes part of a performer's identity that they feel good about somebody, So I think the creative community's availability that widened post-Trump is still equally wide. But on the other hand, the ultimate messaging and leadership has to come from the political sphere. I mean, Harry Belafonte didn't tell Martin Luther King what to say. Martin Luther King had a program and a vision, and Harry Belafonte helped support that vision and popularize that position, and was also an advisor personally to King. But King was the thought leader. So I think, I'm hoping that the Democrats can nationalize the midterms and create a simple enough set of choices that it lends itself to what artists are capable of conveying to their fans in in a united and coherent way. And I don't
Well,
know if that's going to happen.
that's one of the. I mean, in some ways, it's hard to think about it that way, but it's one of the great gifts of Trump in 2020 was that it was such a good bullseye, right? This it's a much more complicated story. It's a much harder story to tell, unless he runs again. It's
Well, he's not going to
because
run in the midterms, although there
no,
are
that's
people
for sure.
saying, there are definitely people that are saying if the House goes Republican, that maybe they should make Trump the speaker, which
Yes,
could be
there are those
a
people.
nightmare that would be. And it's actually, they could do it. You don't have to be a member of the
No,
House to be elected speaker. They can elect
no,
anyone they want as speaker of the
anyone.
House.
Yeah, maybe you. Who knows? Maybe
Maybe
me.
me or you. Yeah, we'll
Yeah,
flip a coin.
yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
but
Exactly.
so we'll see. I think that there's some pretty, I'm a big believer. Again, I come out of the record business of pre-digital, where you sold albums because people liked a single. And the way a single became a hit was getting played hundreds of times on a radio station. And the radio stations would play it by researching 30-second excerpts of a song and seeing what people on the phone responded to. And that's how things got played 20 times a day on the radio.
Really?
And so it all came back to a 30 or 40-second hook. And I think that if I were the Democrats, I would just focus on prescription drugs. To me, that's an issue that affects everybody, whether you're right wing or left wing. The idea that insulin and asthma inhalers are 10 times more expensive in Canada. Bernie Sanders tweets about this and talks
In the
about it.
United States, yeah, yeah.
In the United States is
Yeah.
so much more expensive than any other country. And again, no matter what your politics are, whatever tax policy you believe in, whether you believe in global warming or not, I mean, there's very few people that don't have to deal with prescription drug prices. I wish they would simplify down to that issue, or pick an issue instead of this like Build Back Better. I don't even know what that means. I mean, I wouldn't go see a movie with that title. I mean, what is that?
It's the era of really terrible. I mean, that's what I mean by the Democrats. Sadly, they're so bad at that. Build Back Better, defund the police. Like, really, could you pick something better?
Oh, that's not. Listen, that's not fair. Defund the police is not a Democratic Party slogan.
No, it's not.
Build Back Better was an official slogan and the name of the bill created by the people we elected. Defund the police. Some people said it at rallies. The right wing astutely focused on it as a way of scaring a lot of voters. And you can't expect Democrats to control every placard and every sign at every rally. I mean, the other side has Nazi swastikas at their rallies. So I don't think we're going to judge either. So I think the defund the police thing is easier to rebut, because you can have every Democrat, Nancy Pelosi, always say, we're against that. We never said that. Biden said, I don't believe in that. And there's a reasonable, but Build Back Better, they chose that.
Well, yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. It is. It's even harder to say.
What does it even mean? Anyone could co-opt it. What does it mean? Whereas if you say, do you want to, pay 1/10 as much for prescription drugs, just the way that people right over the border do?
It's more like a Dr. Seuss title of a Dr. Seuss book. Build Back Better.
Yeah,
Betty.
So it's so I think that's. I think that's a big deal. We'll see what happens. It's so easy to get demoralized because there's this other factor. And everybody I talk to is depressed these days politically, and a lot of it is because the mainstream media mostly is working in a paradigm that was created in the 70s and 80s, where they think their job is to criticize whoever's in power.
Whoever it is.
As if Biden is the same as Trump, another president, our job is to criticize him, as if there's not a fascist threat, 1 inch away. And plus,
say something about that. But let's go back to that. But say something about that piece. That do you think? I mean, are you of the opinion that there's a fascist threat 1 inch away? That was one of my questions. Is like, I mean, to me, it seems. I don't know if it's imminent, but it's right. It's there. It's absolutely there.
I mean, I don't know. Look, I mean, these words are always loaded, and most of us. I was certainly brought up when I hear fascist, I think of the Nazis. I think of concentration camps. I think of genocide. And I'm not saying that's what the Republicans would do. I know that they include in their coalition people who wear T-shirts that say 6 million wasn't enough, meaning 6 million Jews killed was not enough,
Yeah. Yeah.
and who have swastikas tattoos on them, and they welcome them into the Republican coalition and do not and will not criticize them. I know that they're interested in just enriching their own friends and the hell with everybody else, and that they believe violence is seems to be an acceptable political tool based on January 6th and the rhetoric that you hear. So I think it's a real threat. I mean, and the changing in the voting laws and everything like that. I'm hoping that there becomes a critical mass coalescence around voting rights, which is really was one of the primary goals of the civil rights movement,
Huge.
and which is, I think, I think that's a winning argument along, a democracy as a winning argument. And hopefully that goes to the front burner. I mean, it's just so hard to know what's gonna happen. But I think that look, I've not been a fan of Republicans. I was raised by parents who were horrified by the McCarthy period and Nixon's role in red baiting people, and
Sure.
new friends that were blacklisted in the 50s who literally couldn't work. I mean, this is certainly not the first time there's been an authoritarian right-wing threat in the United States.
Right.
But it's one of those times.
Yes, that's how it feels. And I mean, and I hope you'll say something about that, is whatever one says about which side, yes, Biden won clearly, clearly, and 75 million people voted for Trump, and those people are still around. And will they all come out at the midterms? Well, maybe, who knows, we'll see. But they're going to be here. They're here. They're going to be here. So are you sitting there with the hope for, or the idea that there is the possibility of bridging, of creating bridges? I mean, we probably both grew up at a similar time where people reached the cross. They went, they had drinks, they whatever, they hated each other on the floor, and then they worked together.
Well,
And now that doesn't happen.
yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, the bigger gaps that I'm really more interested in is human gaps. My wife's brother is the mayor of a small town in Connecticut. It's a population of 2,000-3,000 people, and that voted, I think, 65% for Trump. And he's an ardent lefty. They all know it. But because it's a small enough town and people know each other in terms of who's going to fix the bridge and who can figure out how much to pay for the new fire truck, and is that he's an inspiration to me, because he's totally uncompromising about his beliefs, but he's got a warmth and a compassion about expressing them. And I do think it's worth treating everybody as a human being and not dehumanizing people just because they voted for someone that I think is a fascist. First of all, people don't all have the same kind of background, the same education, and different things affect them. So I think that trying to see people as human beings and not be so into our tribal identities politically, that's something I really aspire to be part of. And I think artists are a useful part of that effort, because you go to a Bruce Springsteen concert, there are people there that are for Trump. I talked to Springsteen about this. He said, look, I have family members that were for Trump. Of course, so I have a big audience. Of course, some of them are for Trump. Everyone knows who Bruce is for. He's certainly been
Right.
ambiguous about his politics, particularly in 2020. But yet he creates a sense of joy and community that if you're in that, if you're in that theater, I just was lucky enough to see him a week or two ago. There's a sense of, well, these are human beings standing to the left and right of me. So I think that really helps. The political system, this romanticization of the great days when they would have drinks afterwards. I don't know that the country was so great in those days. I mean, I'm very suspicious of people who romanticize the past, because in the past, Reagan was to me, had the same racists in his coalition that Trump does. Reagan was just as interested in cutting taxes for the wealthy and screw everyone else and dismantling the New Deal. and so forth. I think the parties did change after the Civil Rights Bill, because you used to have the phenomenon of Southern Democrats who were kind of, pro-segregation, but were for, Social Security or something like that. And that paradigm shifted after Kennedy and Johnson. But I think that these divisions are not new. Obviously, we had a civil war in this country, and the residue of the Civil War to this day is part of the dialogue of the country. So I just think it's the same old kind of cosmic issue of how can we just get along as human beings, and how do you take your values that you would deal with your neighbors, and can that be injected into the general system of scale up to hundreds of millions of people? Really hard to do. But I just think, you do what you can every day. And I do think that the people who go into politics, most of them are lawyers. They tend to think legalistically. The notion of legislation are laws. And lawyers are not the greatest communicators in the world. And if you want to move people, you need people other than lawyers expressing why one thing or another is important. And in general, I think art makes the world a better place, and I really appreciate that Biden, for years, it was just impossible to get much support from the US for the arts. You had this National Endowment for the Arts. It's kind of this little area of a certain kind of, museums and certain high culture that would get grants. And meanwhile, countries like Canada, I have 2 Canadian clients. They have, going back decades and decades and decades, funds. So for recording artists, they help subsidize tours because they believe that it's important for their country that they not be so overwhelmed by their neighbor to the south. And the US has never done it. Same Germany, Australia, England, we're always the worst at that. Biden in these COVID bills did include money for nightclubs and venues and concert promoters and people who work with artists. And for all my disappointment that I wish Biden had done this or had done that, I just think it's worth recognizing he's done some things that are really good. He wasn't my first, second, or third choice for the nomination. I'm a lefty. I wanted Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders or Jay Inslee, or there are a lot of other people I would have preferred. But I think we got a little lucky with him in terms of his headspace about issues and the role of the federal government.
Well, plus he could do the things
I'm not sure he can mobilize the country going to the midterms, and he's got a lot of forces arrayed against him. But
he did have that. He did have those qualities that you were just referring to, right? I mean, there is something. Even the people who want to make believe they hate him, some people hate him, but even the people who want to make believe can't help but say he's a nice guy.
Yeah, right? He means well. I think intentions really matter.
Yeah.
And we'll see. It's such a screwed up system, and it's never was the greatest system. I mean, people talk about getting rid of the filibuster. There's a columnist named Elie Mystal who writes for The Nation, who just wrote a column saying, why don't we just abolish the Senate? And I don't think that there's a possible way that if we were creating the government now, that we would have a Senate where people in Wyoming, where are you in Wyoming?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, you don't deserve the same amount of senators as New York State does or California.
It's kind of crazy. It's
you got 1/10 or 1/20 of the population.
It's incredible here. So I'm a recent resident of Wyoming. So and in all sorts of ways, I love it for the reasons you were talking about. That my neighbors, none of whom share my political stance on anything, are incredibly nice, welcoming, helpful, inviting human beings. So
yeah. Well, you can rationalize it any way you want, but the idea that my vote should only count 1/10 as much as your vote is not morally defensible. And that applies to the presidency also, because the Electoral College includes credit for that the Senate side of it. It's just ridiculous. Anyway, what are we going to do? It's better than being dead. America has produced a lot of great things. I love rock and roll and jazz and the blues and
Right.
Hollywood, and seem to have been an innovator in a lot of this digital stuff. And it's a beautiful place. And one at a time, I tend to like Americans. I just think collectively, not clear where we're going to
Yes.
land.
Right.
Not clear,
I
but
suspect many of the
let's keep our fingers crossed.
many of the people on January 6th, if you met them in the local pub, you could have a decent conversation. But put them all together, and
Well, a lot of it is also there's really is a psychological operations and brainwashing that's pretty sophisticated. There's this podcast that MSNBC produced called American Radical. It's just its fifth or sixth episode now, and it revolves around a woman who got killed on after January 6th. Not Ashley Babbitt, but there was another woman who died a couple of days later, whose family, I think they're from Georgia, and they just noticed in the year leading up to it, she went down a rabbit hole of QAnon one night and never was the same after it. And they got people in on this slogan called "Save the Children," and of course, I want to save children too. And of course, any decent person is horrified by the idea of sex trafficking of children or anything like that. Is among the worst moral crimes imaginable. But then, it's the same as the libel that they used to use back in the what they called blood libel, when they said Jews were drinking the blood of babies,
yes.
to justify the pogroms. They take a wholesome human desire to protect children, and through extreme amount of repetition, using these algorithms that YouTube and other people have, convince them that Tom Hanks and Hillary Clinton
Right.
or some cabal
in a pizzeria in New York
abuse children, and I'm not sure that the good guys have figured out how to counteract that. It's outside of my expertise, but
well, I think it's actually
it's nerve wracking. If you've ever known anyone in a cult, I've known a number of people in religious cults.
Really?
Boy, when you're in it, it's very hard to trust any information that comes in from outside of it.
Well, it's yeah. I mean, it's not just you. It's not clear anybody knows what, right? I mean, we don't know what social media is doing. We don't know what the algorithms will produce, and I'm a big fan of look, innovation is you have to experiment to move forward.
Oh my God, I go on YouTube all the time. I mean, you find some old clip of Mick Jagger and Bob Dylan singing together, or amazing old commercials that you remember from when you were a kid. I mean, it's incredible.
Yes.
But it's a challenge for the society, and
it is.
It's a society that's been so committed, especially for the last since 40 years or so, to just maximizing profits, and with the trickle down Reagan idea that if the rich get richer, it trickles down to everybody else. And it's unfortunately just not true.
It's so clearly the opposite. Anybody who's counted is right. I mean, every economic look at it is, it is not. That is not the case. It is absolutely not the case.
No, it's nerve wracking. Anyway.
So do you consider yourself? I mean, we can end soon, but so you're clearly a Democrat. You're progressive. Yes. You're a Bernie person. Are you a capitalist?
Well, I don't, I believe in modified capitalism. There is no, I think pure capitalism without any regulation at all would allow child labor and any kind of pollution and
slavery.
And so on. So, I think that there's no evidence that pure communism produces a decent society. I mean,
that's true.
I think there are some models that are better than ours, like Canada, Denmark, Sweden, Germany. They all have at least the healthcare for everybody, and nobody has college debt in the six figures in any of those countries. So I don't know what the perfect system is, the exact balance between capitalism and social safety net, regulation, government,
right.
Socialist aspects. I mean, everybody who gets Social Security likes something about socialism. And everybody who makes any money at all like something about capitalism. So I think it's kind of a false paradigm.
Absolutely.
But I like I always say, I don't know what the perfect system is, but to me, for America, let's at least get up to the standard of the other countries in the world. And then we can worry about what the perfect system is. Right now, I think at least if prescription drug prices were the same here as in Canada, if Americans had the same access to healthcare as average people in other countries, if college was equally affordable as in other countries, if some other things like that, then we could think about, okay, how do we want to improve on that? But we're not there yet. And there's examples in 20 other countries of how to
do that.
those things
And
better.
there's 5 different approaches to doing
again,
it.
with guns, pollution and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And then collectively, the human race has to make it even better, but right now we're literally 20th or 30th in most categories compared to other countries in the world, except the size of our military. But I'll tell you this, when people say to me, oh, how come Bruce Springsteen's making all that money from selling his catalog? I say, he earned it. I mean, there was no bribery involved. There was no corruption. There was no pollution. I think that's appropriate. I assume he'll give some of it away, like most people do when they make that much money. He's always been very good at raising money for causes and so on. So, I worked in record companies. I didn't think they were purely ethical institutions, but generally speaking, I thought we were, it was a legitimate business, a legitimate way to make a living.
It seems to me that it's one of the most successful mechanisms for social innovation. And yes, and unregulated, and if there is such a thing, it's insane. And anybody who, do you like roads? Socialism. It's nutty.
And by the way, I feel the same way about anarchists. I remember, I loved going down to Occupy Wall Street. I was living in Lower Manhattan then, and I'd go there a lot. And it was inspiring, the level of idealism, and people that were never part of any left-wing organizations felt a home there and felt empowered. And it changed the conversation in the country for the better. There's no Bernie Sanders, I don't think, without Occupy Wall Street, but there's a Bernie Sanders, but there's not a mass appeal popularity of Bernie Sanders.
Right.
But when people start talking about anarchism, I would say, doesn't anarchism mean that the mafia runs everything? Like, why would we be for that?
Why would we want
that?
Yeah, reasonable people with good intentions coming together to figure out. That seems nice. Yeah.
So I don't like. I think libertarianism and anarchism have far too much in common from my comfort level. There were people that had the word anarchist next to their name historically, like Emma Goldman, that I think were good people, moral people that were against the war and that were for empowerment of the poor people. But as a philosophy of running a society, not with the species in our current state of evolution, maybe if we become saintly beings, we don't need a government.
They both feel very naive.
Yeah.
Right. The versions of those.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a pleasure. It's actually been a pleasure getting to know you. So
hey, you too. I know.
Although we sit on the board.